Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something a little unusual. We're going to answer a question that seems simple on the surface. Almost too simple, the kind of thing you might have wondered about as a child and then quietly set aside. But underneath it, there's an entire universe of evolutionary history, ancient migration, biological survival, and the slow, patient work of time itself. Tonight, we are asking, why did humans become white? And before you assume this is going to be a short answer, a quick biology lesson, a couple of genes, done, let me tell you now that this story stretches back more than 2 million years. It involves volcanoes and ice ages. It involves ancestors walking barefoot across landscapes that no longer exist. It involves the sun, not as a pleasant thing you put sunscreen on to avoid, but as a force so powerful it quietly shaped the very skin you are wearing right now. So get comfortable. You are about to travel a very long way. Before we begin, a small moment. If you find these sleepy tales comforting, you can like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. No pressure. Just know that it genuinely helps, and it means a great deal. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. I always love knowing that someone in a rainy city somewhere, or under a clear desert sky, or curled up in a tiny apartment with a cat on their feet, is drifting off to these stories. We are all listening together, even if we are far apart. Now, let's start at the very beginning. Not the beginning of civilization. Not the beginning of farming or writing or cities or any of the things we usually think of when we say history. We're going further back than that. Much further. We're going to a place called Africa about 2 million years ago when the ancestors of modern humans were just beginning to become something recognizable, something that walked upright, used tools, lived in groups, and stared up at a sky that was relentlessly, punishingly bright. These were not quite us, but they were on their way. They belonged to a group we now call the genus Homo, and they would eventually, slowly, over an almost incomprehensible stretch of time, give rise to Homo sapiens, the species you and I belong to. At this point in the story, almost everyone on Earth looked roughly the same. Dark skin, very dark skin, and that was not an accident. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Skin color is not random. It is not decorative. It is not arbitrary. Every shade of human skin on this planet is the result of an ancient negotiation between the body and the environment. A slow, wordless conversation conducted over thousands of generations, written not in language but in DNA. The story of why humans became white is, at its heart, a story about survival. It is a story about what happens when you take a creature perfectly adapted to one environment and walk them, slowly, over millennia, into a completely different one. It is a story about a molecule called melanin, a vitamin called D, a handful of genetic mutations that changed everything, and the extraordinary fact that this transformation happened not once, but at least twice, independently, in different parts of the world. Scientists still debate the precise timeline of when light skin first appeared in modern humans. For a long time, the assumption was that it happened very gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. But recent genetic studies have complicated that picture considerably, and we will get to those complications in their own time as the story unfolds. For now, just know this. The answer is stranger and more interesting than most people expect. There is one lesser-known curiosity worth planting in your mind right at the start. Our early human ancestors, the ones who came before Homo sapiens, were almost certainly not dark-skinned in the way we might imagine. Some researchers believe that the very first members of our lineage, before hair loss, before the long-distance running adaptations, may have had lighter skin beneath thick body fur, much like other primates do today. It was only after our ancestors lost most of their body hair, sometime between 1 and 2 million years ago, that dark skin became essential. In other words, dark skin itself was an adaptation. It was an answer to a problem, and understanding that problem is where our story truly begins. But that is for the next section. For now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's talk about the sun. Not the sun, the one you glance at through a car window, or feel on your shoulders during a lunch break, or occasionally worry about when you forget to apply sunscreen before a long afternoon outside. The sun we are talking about tonight is something older and more serious than that. This is the equatorial African sun, the sun that hung directly overhead day after day for millions of years, pouring ultraviolet radiation down onto the open savanna with an intensity that most people alive today, living in temperate climates, spending most of their hours indoors, have simply never experienced. This sun was not background scenery. It was an active force, a pressure, a filter, and every creature that lived beneath it had to find a way to survive it, or quietly disappear. To understand what that sun was doing to early human bodies, you need to understand a molecule called melanin. Melanin is a pigment. It is produced by specialized cells in the skin called melanocytes. And despite what you might assume, every human being on Earth has roughly the same number of melanocytes. That is worth pausing on. It is not the number of melanocytes that differs between people with dark skin and people with light skin. It is how active those cells are, how much melanin they produce, and what kind. There are two main types of melanin in human skin. There is eumelanin, which is dark brown to black, and pheomelanin, which is reddish and yellow. People with darker skin produce more eumelanin. People with lighter skin produce proportionally more pheomelanin. And eumelanin, it turns out, is one of the most elegant biological shields ever evolved. Here is what melanin actually does. When ultraviolet radiation, specifically UVB, hits the skin, it penetrates into the deeper layers and begins to damage DNA. This is the same process that causes sunburns, and over a lifetime of exposure without protection, it dramatically increases the risk of skin cancer. But UV radiation does something else too, something that does not get talked about nearly as much. It destroys folate. Folate, also known as vitamin B9, is a nutrient that is absolutely essential for the replication of DNA, for the formation of red blood cells, and most critically of all, for the development of a healthy fetus in the early weeks of pregnancy. When UV radiation breaks down folate in the body, the consequences are not immediately visible. They are quiet, invisible, but they are devastating. Low folate in pregnant women is directly linked to neural tube defects, serious malformations of the developing brain and spinal cord in the embryo. In other words, too much sun, unfiltered, unprotected sun, did not just give you a bad burn. It could end a pregnancy. It could end a bloodline. This is the theory that evolutionary biologist Nina Jablonski and her colleague George Chaplin proposed in a landmark paper published in 2000, and it fundamentally changed the way scientists think about the evolution of skin color. Before their work, the dominant assumption was that dark skin evolved primarily to prevent skin cancer. And skin cancer is certainly a real risk of UV exposure, particularly for older individuals. But here is the problem with the skin cancer explanation. Skin cancer almost always develops after reproductive age. From the ruthless perspective of natural selection, a disease that kills you after you have already had children does very little to shape the evolution of a species. Folate destruction, on the other hand, strikes during the most reproductively critical window imaginable, pregnancy itself. That is a selection pressure with real teeth. So dark skin, rich in eumelanin, became the answer. A biological sunscreen, a shield against UV radiation that was built directly into the body, maintained across generations, because the individuals who had it survived and reproduced more successfully than those who did not. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Your skin, whatever shade it is not merely cosmetic. It is a piece of ancient engineering. It is the solution to a problem that your ancestors faced every single day for hundreds of thousands of years under a sky that was trying its very best to do them harm. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for tonight's section. Melanin does not only absorb UV radiation. It also converts that radiation into heat, harmless, dissipated heat, with an efficiency of more than 99.9%. Almost no other molecule in biology can do this. Scientists have described melanin as a near-perfect photoprotector because it neutralizes UV energy before it can trigger the chemical reactions that damage DNA. There are researchers who have spent entire careers trying to synthesize an artificial molecule that does what melanin does, and none of them have come close. Evolution got there first, and it did it quietly over millions of years without a laboratory or a grant proposal. Scientists still debate exactly how far back dark skin goes in the human lineage. Some genetic studies suggest that the version of the MC1R gene that produces consistently dark skin in modern humans became fixed in our lineage somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, roughly coinciding with the loss of body hair. Others argue the picture is more complex and that pigmentation may have been variable for much longer than that. What most researchers agree on is this. By the time Homo sapiens emerged as a distinct species, somewhere around 300,000 years ago, dark skin was already ancient. It was already the default. It was already home, and it would remain home for a very long time. But already, somewhere on the horizon, not yet visible, not yet imaginable, a change was coming. A slow drift, a wandering, a first step away from everything the human body had always known. For a very long time, Africa was everything. It was the whole world as far as our ancestors were concerned. Not because they lacked curiosity and not because they lacked the ability to move, but because Africa is enormous and varied and full, and for hundreds of thousands of years it provided everything a growing human population needed. Food, water, shelter, company. There was no particular reason to leave. And yet, slowly, in ways that left no written record, no conscious decision, no memory, some of them did. The story of human migration out of Africa is one of the most remarkable journeys in the history of life on this planet. It did not happen all at once. It did not happen because someone looked at a map, there were no maps, and decided that the grass might be greener on the other side of the continent. It happened the way most great evolutionary changes happen. Gradually, almost invisibly, one small group at a time, following food and water and the slow drift of climate, moving a little further than the generation before them, and then stopping and settling and having children, and then those children moving a little further still. Generation by generation, valley by valley, river by river, a walk that took thousands of years. The earliest members of the genus Homo, species like Homo erectus, were already leaving Africa more than 1 million years ago. Fossils of Homo erectus have been found as far afield as Georgia in the Caucasus, Indonesia, and China. These were remarkable travelers, and they did it without shoes, without maps, without any of the tools we associate with long-distance movement. They simply walked. They followed coastlines and river valleys because water is life, and the edges of things, the places where land meets water, where forest meets grassland, tend to be rich in food. But the migration we're most interested in tonight is a more recent one. The migration of Homo sapiens, us. The current scientific consensus, built from decades of genetic research, fossil discoveries, and increasingly sophisticated archaeological analysis, places the emergence of anatomically modern humans in Africa at roughly 300,000 years ago. For most of the time since then, we stayed. The oldest confirmed evidence of Homo sapiens outside Africa dates to around 90,000 to 120,000 years ago from sites in Levant, the region that includes modern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. But those early excursions may not have lasted. The migration that truly reshaped the world, the one whose descendants eventually populated every continent on Earth, is generally dated to somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago. A relatively small group of people, perhaps just a few thousand individuals, crossed out of Africa, possibly through the Horn of Africa and across the narrow strait that connects it to the Arabian Peninsula. And the world changed. Here is something worth pausing to appreciate. Every non-African person alive on Earth today, every single one, is descended from that founding group. Every European, every East Asian, every indigenous American, every Pacific Islander, every person from the Indian subcontinent or the Middle East or Central Asia. All of them trace their ancestry back to that small, wandering population of Africans who stepped across a narrow strip of water sometime around 60,000 years ago. The genetic diversity found within Africa today is greater than the genetic diversity found in all the rest of the world combined, because the people who left took only a fraction of Africa's genetic variety with them. They were a small sample of something much larger, and they carried that small sample into an enormous, empty, waiting world. Now, what did those first migrants look like? This is where our story about skin color begins to shift. The people who left Africa almost certainly had dark skin. They were leaving a continent where, for hundreds of thousands of years, dark skin had been the correct answer to the environment's most urgent question. They carried their melanin with them the way they carried everything else. Not because they chose to, but because it was part of them, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. For a while, possibly a long while, it served them perfectly well. The regions they first moved through were not dramatically different from Africa in terms of UV intensity. The Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, Southeast Asia, these are not cold, dim places. The sun still shone with considerable force, and melanin was still doing exactly what it had always done. But some of those wanderers kept walking. Northward, always a little further northward, into landscapes that were genuinely different. Not just unfamiliar in terms of terrain and vegetation, but different in a way that the human body had never encountered before. Different in terms of light. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this section. Genetic studies have found that all non-African humans share a very specific set of mutations that are almost absent in African populations. These mutations, the legacy of what geneticists call the founding bottleneck, mean that non-African populations are, in a measurable genetic sense, less diverse than many single ethnic groups within Africa. The Yoruba people of Nigeria, for example, carry more genetic diversity within their population than exists in the entire continent of Europe. This is not a small or trivial finding. It means that the story of human diversity, in its richest and most complex form, is still written in Africa. Everything else, every adaptation, every migration, every new trait that evolved in the populations that left, is a footnote to that original text. Scientists still debate the exact number and timing of the migration waves out of Africa. For years, the dominant model was a single dispersal event around 60,000 years ago. But newer genetic and archaeological evidence suggests there may have been multiple earlier waves, groups that left Africa before the main dispersal and either died out or contributed small amounts of ancestry to modern populations. The picture is messier and more interesting than a single clean exodus. But the broad shape of the story holds. People left. They walked into the unknown, and bit by bit, they began to change. The sun that awaited them in the north was not the sun they had always known. It was quieter, lower, paler, and that quietness, that paleness, was about to become a problem. Imagine walking north, not for a day or a week or even a season, but for generations. Your children are born a little further north than you were. Their children are born a little further north than them. And with each generation, the landscape shifts, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, accumulating way that only becomes visible when you look back across centuries. The trees change, the animals change, the quality of the air changes, and the sky changes. This is the thing that does not get talked about enough when people discuss human migration. We focus on the geography, the mountains crossed, the rivers forded, the coastlines followed. But the sky is geography too. The angle of the sun, the length of the day, the intensity of the light falling on your skin at noon in December. These are not small differences. They are the difference between a world where melanin is a gift and a world where melanin, that ancient, elegant, beautifully engineered shield, begins to become something closer to a liability. Here is the physics of it, stated as simply as possible. The Earth is a sphere, and it is tilted. At the equator, the sun passes almost directly overhead, and its rays travel through a relatively thin slice of atmosphere before reaching the ground. The result is intense, concentrated UV radiation, the kind that built dark skin and kept it dark for hundreds of thousands of years. But as you move toward the poles, the geometry changes. The sun sits lower in the sky. Its rays strike the Earth at an angle, traveling through a much thicker column of atmosphere before they arrive. That atmosphere absorbs and scatters UV radiation. By the time sunlight reaches the ground at a latitude of, say, 50 or 60 degrees north, roughly the latitude of modern-day England or Scandinavia or Canada, the UVB radiation is dramatically weaker than it is at the equator. In winter, at those latitudes, UVB radiation is so weak that the skin essentially cannot produce any vitamin D from sunlight at all, regardless of how long you stand outside. For the first populations moving into these northern regions, this was not immediately obvious. There was no thermometer for UV, no instrument to measure what the sky was or was not providing. There was only the slow, invisible pressure of natural selection, the quiet statistical fact that over many generations, certain individuals fared slightly better than others, had slightly more surviving children, passed slightly different versions of their genes into the future. Natural selection does not announce itself. It does not send a memo. It simply keeps score across thousands of years in the currency of surviving offspring. And here's what the scorecard was beginning to register in these northern populations. Dark skin, so perfectly suited to the African sun, was now blocking something the body desperately needed. UVB radiation, the same radiation that dark skin had evolved to deflect, is also the radiation that triggers vitamin D synthesis in the skin. When UVB photons strike the skin, they convert a cholesterol compound in the skin cells into a precursor molecule that the body then processes into active vitamin D. This is the only significant natural source of vitamin D for most human beings. You can get small amount from certain foods, fatty fish, egg yolks, liver. But for most of human history, and in most environments, the skin was the primary factory. And dark skin, dense with melanin, beautifully designed to filter out UVB, was now filtering out the very signal the body needed to run that factory. The cruel irony of this situation is almost poetic. The same feature that had protected human beings for hundreds of thousands of years, that had shielded their DNA, preserved their folate, kept their pregnancies intact under the blazing African sun, was now, in a completely different environment, working against them. Evolution does not plan ahead. It does not anticipate future environments. It simply builds what works right now, in this place under these conditions. And the conditions had changed. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this section. The relationship between latitude and skin color in human populations is so consistent that scientists have been able to use it almost like a law of nature. In a landmark analysis, Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin mapped skin reflectance data, measurements of how much light skin reflects, which correlates directly with how light or dark it is, against annual UV radiation levels at hundreds of locations around the world. The correlation was striking. The further from the equator a population had lived for thousands of years, the lighter their skin tended to be. The relationship held across continents, across oceans, across populations with no historical contact with one another. It was one of the clearest examples of convergent evolution, the same solution being arrived at independently in response to the same environmental pressure ever documented in human biology. Scientists still debate the relative speed of this adaptation. For a long time, it was assumed that the lightening of skin in northern populations was a gradual process, playing out over tens of thousands of years in a slow, steady drift toward less melanin. But ancient DNA studies, a field that has exploded in sophistication over the last 2 decades, have complicated that picture considerably. Some analyses suggest that the key mutations associated with light skin in Europeans did not become common until surprisingly recently, perhaps only within the last 10 to 6,000 years. That would make the lightening of European skin not a slow Paleolithic drift, but something closer to a rapid recent shift. What caused that acceleration is one of the most interesting arguments in the field right now, and we will come back to it. For now, settle into the quiet of this moment. The northern sky stretches above you, pale and vast. The sun hangs low, casting long shadows even at midday. The UV radiation that falls on your skin is a fraction of what your ancestors knew in Africa. And deep within the cells of the people living under this quieter sky, something is beginning to stir. A change is coming. Small, invisible, patient, but coming. Let's talk about vitamin D. Not in the way you might see it discussed on the side of a cereal box, or in a listicle about supplements you should be taking, or in a brief conversation with a doctor who tells you to spend more time outside. Let's talk about it the way it actually matters. As a molecule so fundamental to human biology that its absence, sustained over generations, can quietly reshape an entire species. Because that is exactly what it did. Vitamin D is not really a vitamin in the traditional sense. Most vitamins are compounds the body cannot make on its own, which is why we have to obtain them from food. But vitamin D, at least in its primary form, is something the human body manufactures itself, using sunlight as the raw material. This makes it less like a vitamin and more like a hormone. And it behaves like one too. Vitamin D receptors have been found in nearly every tissue in the human body, in the bones, the muscles, the immune system, the brain, the gut, the heart. It does not just do one thing. It does dozens of things quietly, continuously, without any fanfare, in almost every system the body operates. The most well-known function of vitamin D is the regulation of calcium and phosphorus, the minerals that build and maintain bone. Without sufficient vitamin D, the intestines cannot absorb calcium efficiently, regardless of how much calcium you consume. The result in children is a disease called rickets, a condition in which the bones soften and deform, causing bowed legs, stunted growth, and in severe cases, dangerous deformities of the pelvis. A pelvis deformed by rickets is not just a medical inconvenience. In a world without modern obstetrics, a severely narrowed pelvis meant death in childbirth. For women, for infants, for both. This is, again, a selection pressure with real biological consequences, the kind that natural selection notices across generations in a most unforgiving way possible. But the consequences of vitamin D deficiency go well beyond bone. Modern research has linked chronic vitamin D deficiency to impaired immune function, increased susceptibility to infectious disease, higher rates of certain cancers, cardiovascular problems, and complications during pregnancy. In populations living through long, dark winters at high latitudes, eating diets that provided little vitamin D from food, the deficiency would not have been occasional or seasonal. It would have been structural, persistent, generational, a quiet drain on health and reproductive success that accumulated invisibly across hundreds of years. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this section. The connection between sunlight, vitamin D, and bone health was recognized far earlier than most people realize, but it took a surprisingly long time to be properly understood. In the early 17th century, physicians in northern European cities began documenting a widespread childhood illness characterized by soft, deformed bones. By the 1600s, rickets was so common in the industrializing cities of England that some historians have called it the first epidemic of indoor living, a disease born not from a pathogen, but from architecture, smoke, and the simple fact that factory children spent their days inside buildings that blocked the sun. It was not until 1922 that the biochemist Elmer McCullum identified vitamin D as the specific compound responsible for preventing the disease. And it was not until several decades after that the full mechanism, UVB striking the skin, triggering a cascade of chemical conversions, was properly mapped. For our northern ancestors, there was no such understanding. There was only the body doing its best in a world that had grown darker. Now, the human body is not entirely helpless in the face of this problem. One partial solution is behavioral. People can seek out whatever sunlight is available, expose more skin during the brief, bright months of summer, and store some vitamin D and body fat during that time to draw on through the winter. Another partial solution is dietary. Fatty fish, salmon, herring, mackerel are among the richest natural food sources of vitamin D. Populations living near coastlines or rivers with reliable access to these foods had a meaningful nutritional buffer against deficiency. This is one reason why researchers believe that the vitamin D crisis would have been most acute not for coastal populations, but for inland populations, people living in forests and plains far from the sea, relying on terrestrial animals and plant foods that provided very little vitamin D. These inland northerners faced the full force of the problem, and the body's response, over generations, was elegantly simple. If you cannot get more UVB into the skin from outside, make the skin more permeable to the UVB that is available. Reduce the melanin. Let more light through. Scientists still debate the exact magnitude of the selective pressure that vitamin D deficiency exerted on northern populations. Some researchers argue it was the dominant driver of skin lightening, the primary engine of the whole process. Others suggest it was one factor among several, and that its relative importance varied by population, by diet, by latitude, and by time period. There is also a minority view, not widely accepted but not entirely dismissed, that sexual selection played a role, with lighter skin being preferentially chosen as a mate characteristic in certain populations for reasons unrelated to UV or vitamin D. The debate is ongoing, and the evidence is genuinely mixed. But here's what is not debated. The human body was under pressure. Real, biological, generational pressure. And somewhere in the vast, slow machinery of genetic variation, in the tiny random errors that occur when DNA copies itself, in the shuffling and recombining of chromosomes that happens every time a child is conceived, an answer was quietly being assembled. A mutation, or rather, a series of mutations. Small changes in the genetic code that, in the dark north, in the long winters under the pale and insufficient sun, turned out to make all the difference. Close your eyes for a moment, if they are not already closed. Picture the body working. Not dramatically, not urgently, just quietly, cell by cell, generation by generation, searching without knowing it is searching for a way to survive. It will find one. It always does. There is a moment in every great story where the turning point arrives. Not with fanfare, not with thunder or lightning or any of the dramatic signals that stories use to tell you something important is happening. It arrives quietly. A small thing, an almost invisible thing. A single letter changed in a text that is 3 billion letters long. That is what a genetic mutation is at its most fundamental level. The human genome, the complete instruction manual for building and running a human body, contains approximately 3 billion base pairs, the chemical letters that spell out every protein, every structure, every biological process the body is capable of performing. A mutation is a copying error, a misprint, a single letter in that 3 billion letter text that comes out different from the original. Most mutations are harmless. Many are invisible. Some are actively damaging. But occasionally, rarely, beautifully, consequentially, a mutation lands in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment in history in a population that needs it. And when that happens, the mutation spreads. Not because anyone chooses it, not because anyone understands what it does, but because the individuals who carry it survive better, reproduce more successfully, and pass it on to more children, who pass it on to more children across generation after generation, until it becomes not the exception but the rule. The mutation we're talking about tonight is in a gene called SLC24A5. It is not a famous gene. It does not have a catchy name or a dramatic origin story. It sits on chromosome 15, and its job, in its original form, is to help regulate the movement of calcium ions in melanocytes, the pigment-producing cells of the skin. The specific variant that matters for our story involves a single change at position 111 of the protein the gene encodes. An amino acid called alanine is replaced by one called threonine. That is it, one amino acid, out of hundreds, out of billions. And yet the effect on skin color is significant. Studies have found that this single variant, known as the derived allele of SLC24A5, account for somewhere between 25 and 40% of the difference in skin pigmentation between people of European and West African ancestry. A single letter change in the genome, a quarter to nearly half of the visible difference in skin tone between two continental populations. The efficiency of it is almost breathtaking. When did this mutation first appear? Geneticists have been able to estimate this by looking at how much the surrounding DNA has diversified since the mutation arose. A technique called haplotype analysis, which uses the known rate of genetic change as a kind of molecular clock. The current best estimate places the origin of the derived SLC24A5 variant at somewhere between 15,000 and 22,000 years ago. This is a striking finding. It means that one of the key genetic changes underlying light skin in European populations arose not in the deep Paleolithic past, but relatively recently, during or after the last glacial maximum, the coldest and harshest phase of the last ice age, when ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and the populations living at the edges of that ice would have been under intense environmental pressure. But here's where the story gets more complicated and more interesting. SLC24A5 is not the only gene involved. Skin pigmentation in humans is what geneticists call a polygenic trait, a characteristic controlled not by a single gene, but by dozens, possibly hundreds of genetic variants, each contributing a small piece of the total effect. Alongside SLC24A5, researchers have identified several other key players. SLC45A2 is another pigmentation gene with a variant strongly associated with lighter skin in European populations, with a similarly recent origin. OCA2 and HERC2 are genes that interact to influence not just skin tone, but also eye color. The variants associated with blue and green eyes in Europeans are tightly linked to this same cluster of genetic changes. TYRP1 and MC1 are involved in determining the ratio of eumelanin to pheomelanin, the darker and lighter forms of the pigment, and variants in these genes contribute to the full spectrum of skin, hair, and eye color variation seen in European populations today. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this section. The derived variant of SLC24A5 is not found only in Europeans. It is also common in South Asian populations, in people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and it is found at lower frequencies in populations across the Middle East and North Africa. This tells us something important about the history of the people who carried it. The mutation likely arose in a population ancestral to both Europeans and South Asians, a group that lived somewhere in Western Eurasia, probably between 10 and 20,000 years ago, and then spread in both directions as those populations diverged and migrated. In some South Asian populations, the derived variant of SLC24A5 is nearly as common as it is in Northern Europe, even though the people carrying it have considerably darker skin overall. This is because skin color is polygenic. A single gene, even an important one, is not the whole story. It is one voice in a chorus. Scientists still debate the precise selection pressure that drove SLC24A5 and related variants to spread so rapidly through European populations. The vitamin D hypothesis remains the most widely cited explanation. Lighter skin letting in more UVB, enabling more vitamin D synthesis during the short northern summers. But some researchers have pointed out that the timing and geography of the mutation spread do not perfectly align with what you would expect if UV and vitamin D were the only factors at work. Some analyses suggest the mutation spread particularly rapidly after the advent of agriculture in Europe, a period when dietary sources of vitamin D declined sharply. And some researchers have raised the possibility that the mutation spread was partly driven by cultural or social preferences, rather than purely by biology. The full picture is still being assembled, but in the darkness of the northern winter, in the bodies of people who had been walking northward for thousands of years, the mutation was spreading, quietly, persistently, one generation at a time. Turning the dial. Let's pause for a moment on something remarkable, something that does not get nearly enough attention in the popular telling of this story. Because so far we have been following one thread, the thread that leads northward and westward out of Africa, through the Middle East, into the cold heart of Europe, where a handful of key mutations quietly rewrote the pigmentation of an entire continental population over thousands of years. That story is real, and it is fascinating. But it is not the only story. There is another thread, running parallel, independent, arriving at a similar destination by a completely different road. Sometime after the Great Migration out of Africa, in the long, slow centuries of human dispersal across the Eurasian continent, a separate group of populations made their way eastward, through Central Asia, through the steppes and river valleys of what is now China, down into Southeast Asia, northward into the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago, and eventually, in a journey that still astonishes geneticists, across the land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska and into the Americas. These populations faced many of the same environmental challenges that the European populations faced. Northern latitudes, long winters, low UV radiation, the quiet, persistent pressure of vitamin D deficiency pressing against the biology of people whose ancestors had evolved under the African sun. And they solved the problem, but they solved it differently. The genetic architecture of lighter skin in East Asian populations is distinct from the genetic architecture of lighter skin in European populations. This is one of the most important and underappreciated findings in the study of human pigmentation. When geneticists compare the pigmentation-associated variants found in Northern European populations with those found in East Asian populations, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and related groups, they find a largely different set of genes at work. Some genes overlap. OCA2, for example, has variants associated with reduced pigmentation in both European and East Asian populations, though not always the same variants. But many of the key European pigmentation genes, including the derived variant of SLC24A5 that we spent so much time with in the last section, are largely absent in East Asian populations or present at very low frequencies. East Asian populations arrived at lighter skin through their own genetic pathways, their own mutations, their own molecular solutions to the same environmental problem. This is what evolutionary biologists call convergent evolution. It is the same principle that gave dolphins and fish similar body shapes, despite the fact that dolphins are mammals and fish are not. It is the same principle that gave bats and birds wings, despite their completely different evolutionary histories. When two separate populations, in two separate parts of the world, face the same environmental pressure and both evolve the same general solution, lighter skin, but through different genetic mechanisms, that is convergent evolution. And it is one of the most powerful demonstrations available to us that the lightening of skin in northern populations was not random. It was not drift. It was not accident. It was adaptation. The same adaptation demanded by the same environment arrived at independently twice. Some of the key genes involved in East Asian pigmentation adaptation include variants in the gene EDR, which influences not just skin tone, but also hair thickness, sweat gland density, and certain features of tooth shape. The derived variant of EDR, which is extremely common in East Asian populations and in indigenous American populations descended from the same ancestral group, is one of the most dramatic examples of recent natural selection in the human genome. It is thought to have arisen somewhere in Central or Eastern Asia, possibly between 10,000 and 30,000 years ago, and to have swept through the population with remarkable speed, suggesting that it conferred a significant survival advantage. Exactly what that advantage was is still debated. Some researchers focus on its effects on sweat glands. The EDR variant increases the number and density of mammary gland branches, which may have improved the ability of mothers to nurse infants in cold environments. Others focus on its effects on hair and skin and their role in cold adaptation. The full story of EDR is still being written. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this section. The lightening of skin in East Asian populations appears, based on current genetic evidence, to have occurred even more recently than the lightening of skin in European populations. Some analyses place the key East Asian pigmentation adaptations within the last 10,000 years, well within the Holocene, the current geological epoch that began after the end of the last ice age. This is a striking finding, because it suggests that the populations ancestral to modern East Asians may have had relatively dark skin until surprisingly recently in evolutionary terms. It also raises an interesting question, one that researchers are still working to answer, about what specifically triggered the rapid spread of lighter skin variants in East Asia during the Holocene. Was it the same vitamin D pressure that drove European lightning? Was it agricultural change? Was it population movement and mixing? The answer is probably some combination of all three, and the precise proportions are still being argued over in the pages of genetics journals today. Scientists still debate the relative contributions of natural selection, genetic drift, and population movement to the pigmentation patterns seen in modern East Asian populations. Ancient DNA from prehistoric East Asian individuals, a field that is growing rapidly as new archaeological sites are excavated and new sequencing techniques are developed, is beginning to shed light on these questions. Early results suggest that the population history of East Asia was considerably more complex than once assumed, with multiple waves of migration, replacement, and mixing contributing to the genetic landscape of modern populations. The pigmentation story is embedded in that complexity, and pulling it out cleanly is not a simple task. But the broad fact remains, and it is worth sitting with. Two separate human populations on opposite ends of the Eurasian continent, both descended from dark-skinned African ancestors, both pushed northward by the slow drift of migration and climate, both squeezed by the same invisible pressure of UV deficiency and vitamin D need. Both found their way to lighter skin, through different doors, arriving at the same room. It is one of the most elegant things evolution has ever done, not because it planned it, not because it understood what it was doing, but precisely because it did not. Two separate populations, two separate sets of mutations, one shared solution, the same quiet answer, written twice in different handwriting on opposite sides of the world. For most of human history, we were hunters and gatherers. This is not a romantic notion. It is simply a fact. For the vast majority of the approximately 300,000 years that Homo sapiens has existed as a species, and for the millions of years before that, during which our ancestors were becoming us, the way we fed ourselves was the same. We moved. We followed animals. We harvested wild plants, roots, fruits, nuts, and seeds. We fished rivers and coastlines. We ate what the landscape offered in season in the places where it grew. It was not always easy. It was not always comfortable, but it was nutritionally diverse in ways that are easy to underestimate. A hunter-gatherer diet, depending on the environment, could include dozens or even hundreds of different food sources across the course of a year, a breadth of nutritional input that most modern humans, eating from a globalized food system built on a handful of staple crops, have never approached. And then, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. In multiple places independently, human populations began to do something they had never done before. They stayed. They chose a piece of land, cleared it, prepared it, planted it, and waited for it to grow. They domesticated animals, goats, sheep, cattle, pigs, keeping them alive not just for immediate consumption, but as a managed resource. They built permanent structures. They stored food. They developed the concept of a harvest, the idea that the work of spring and summer could sustain you through autumn and winter. This was the Neolithic Revolution, the agricultural transition, and it changed everything. The benefits of agriculture are obvious and real. It enabled populations to grow. It enabled the accumulation of surplus, which in turn enabled specialization. Potters, weavers, traders, priests, rulers. It enabled cities and writing and all the complex social structures we associate with civilization. But it also came with costs that are less often discussed. Nutritional costs. A diet built primarily on cultivated grains, wheat, barley, millet, rice, is a nutritionally narrower diet than the varied hunter-gatherer diet it replaced. Grains are calorie-dense and storable, which is exactly why humans chose to cultivate them. But they are not particularly rich in vitamins and minerals. And critically, for our story, they are almost entirely devoid of vitamin D. The wild foods that hunter-gatherers relied on, fatty fish, organ meats, eggs, certain insects, and larvae, provided meaningful dietary contributions of vitamin D. The staple crops of early agriculture provided essentially none. For agricultural populations living in sunny equatorial regions, this dietary shift was not catastrophic. There was still enough UV radiation in the environment to drive adequate vitamin D synthesis through the skin, even in people with darker skin. The sun filled the gap. But for agricultural populations living at northern latitudes, the early farmers of Europe, spreading northward from the Middle East with their wheat and their cattle and their permanent villages, the dietary shift compounded an existing problem. They were already living in an environment where UV radiation was reduced. They were already, in many cases, spending more time indoors, in their permanent structures, their longhouses, their villages, than their nomadic ancestors had. And now they were eating a diet that provided even less vitamin D than the hunter-gatherer diet it replaced. The pressure on lighter skin to evolve, or to spread, intensified. Here is where the ancient DNA findings become particularly interesting. For many years, researchers assumed that the key pigmentation mutations, the derived variants of SLC24A5, SLC45A2, and related genes, have been spreading gradually through European populations since the earliest days of human settlement in northern latitudes. But when scientists began extracting and sequencing DNA from ancient human remains, from Neolithic farmers, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Bronze Age populations, the picture that emerged was surprising. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Europe, the people who lived in Europe before agriculture arrived, were in many cases significantly darker skinned than the farmers who replaced them. One famous ancient individual, a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer from Spain known as La Brana I, who lived approximately 7,000 years ago, carried the ancestral dark-skin variants of several key pigmentation genes, despite having lived in Europe for thousands of years. He also, intriguingly, carried the variants associated with blue eyes. Dark skin and blue eyes, a combination that is essentially absent in modern European populations, but which appears to have been relatively common in pre-agricultural Europeans. The farmers who arrived in Europe from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, beginning around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, carried lighter skin variants at higher frequencies. As farming populations spread across Europe, mixing with, and in many regions largely replacing the existing hunter-gatherer populations, they brought those lighter-skinned variants with them. And then a few thousand years later, a third wave of people, the Yamnaya, nomadic herders from the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea, swept into Europe, bringing yet another set of genetic variants and further reshaping the population's genetic landscape. Modern Europeans are a mixture of all three. The ancient hunter-gatherers, the Anatolian farmers, and the steppe herders. And their skin color is the product of all three histories, blended together across thousands of years of migration, mixing, and selection. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this section. The arrival of agriculture in Europe did not just change what people ate. It changed the microbiome, the community of bacteria living in the human gut, in ways that affected how efficiently the body absorbed vitamin D and other nutrients. Some researchers believe that the gut microbiome changes associated with agricultural diets may have independently contributed to vitamin D insufficiency in early farming populations, adding yet another layer of pressure on the genetic adaptation toward lighter skin. The human body is not a simple machine. It is a system of systems all talking to each other. And when you change one part of it, the ripples spread further than you expect. Scientists still debate whether the rapid spread of lighter skin variants in European populations was driven primarily by the arrival of Anatolian farmers carrying those variants, or by independent natural selection acting on variants already present in the European gene pool, or by some combination of both. The ancient DNA evidence has complicated the picture considerably, and new findings continue to reshape the consensus. What is clear is that the agricultural transition was not just a change in how humans fed themselves. It was a change in the evolutionary environment, a shift in the pressures acting on the human genome that accelerated changes already underway and added new ones. The farm was not just a place to grow food. It was, in a very real sense, a place where a new kind of human body was being grown. We have spent a great deal of time talking about skin, and rightly so. Skin color is the most visible expression of the adaptations we have been tracing across tens of thousands of years of human migration and evolution. But skin was not the only thing the northern environment was reshaping. Not by a long way. When a population spends thousands of years in a cold, dark, high-latitude environment, when generation after generation is born into long winters and short summers, into landscapes scoured by wind and buried under snow for months at a time, the body does not stop at the surface. It goes deeper. It adjusts more broadly. It rewrites itself in ways that go far beyond pigmentation, touching everything from the shape of the eye to the architecture of the nose to the way the body stores and burns energy in the cold. Let's start with the eyes. The color of the iris, that ring of pigment surrounding the pupil, is, like skin color, determined by melanin. Dark irises, rich in melanin, are the ancestral state. They are found in the vast majority of the world's population, and they were almost certainly the default eye color of the humans who left Africa. Light irises, blue, green, hazel, are the result of reduced melanin in the iris, which causes light to scatter differently and produce those cooler tones. Blue eyes, in particular, appear to be an extremely recent evolutionary development. A 2008 genetic study traced all blue-eyed individuals alive on Earth today back to a single common ancestor, a single individual in whom the relevant mutation first appeared, who lived somewhere around the Black Sea region between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. Every blue-eyed person alive, from a child in Stockholm to a grandmother in Buenos Aires to a fisherman in coastal Alaska, descends from that one individual. Why did the blue eye mutation spread? This is a genuinely contested question. Some researchers argue that it was linked to the same general relaxation of selection pressure for heavy pigmentation in northern latitudes, that in a low UV environment, reduced iris pigmentation was simply not harmful enough to be selected against, and so it drifted to higher frequencies. Others argue that sexual selection played a role, that blue eyes, as a rare and visually striking trait, may have been preferentially chosen in mate selection, giving carriers a reproductive advantage that accelerated the mutation spread. Still others point out that the timing of the blue eye mutations spread coincides with major population movements. The arrival of steppe herders into Europe around 5,000 years ago and suggest that the mutation may have spread partly by riding along with those migrating populations rather than through selection alone. The debate is unresolved. But the fact of it, one ancestor thousands of years ago, one mutation, is one of the most quietly astonishing things in all of human evolutionary history. Now, let's talk about hair. Straight hair, the type most common in East Asian and indigenous American populations, results from hair follicles that are round in cross-section, producing a strand that grows out without curling. Wavy and curly hair results from follicles that are more oval or ribbon-shaped, causing the strand to curl as it grows. Tightly coiled hair, the type most common in sub-Saharan African populations, is produced by highly curved follicles, and it has been proposed that tightly coiled hair may itself be an adaptation to intense solar radiation, creating a natural layer of insulation above the scalp that protects the brain from heat while simultaneously allowing airflow to cool the skin beneath. In colder environments, where heat retention rather than heat dissipation was the priority, looser hair textures may have been less disadvantageous, and a selection pressure maintaining tight coiling may have eased. The nose tells another story. The shape of the nose, specifically the width of the nasal passage, varies significantly across human populations, and this variation correlates with climate in ways that researchers have studied for decades. In hot, humid equatorial environments, wider nasal passages are common, allowing large volumes of air to move efficiently in and out during the kind of sustained aerobic activity, long-distance running, for instance, at which our African ancestors excelled. In cold, dry environments, narrower nasal passages are more common. The reason is physiological. When cold, dry air enters a narrow nasal passage, it travels a longer and more tortuous path before reaching the lungs, giving the nasal tissues more time to warm and humidify it. This protects the delicate tissues of the lower respiratory tract from the damaging effects of cold, dry air. A narrow nose is, in cold climates, essentially a built-in air conditioner, or rather, a built-in air heater and humidifier. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this section. Body shape and proportions also show clear latitudinal adaptation in human populations, in patterns that follow rules first described by 19th century naturalists studying non-human animals. Bergman's rule states that within a species, individuals in colder climates tend to be larger bodied than individuals in warmer climates, because a larger body has a lower surface area to volume ratio, which means it loses heat more slowly. Allen's rule states that individuals in colder climates tend to have shorter limbs relative to body size. For the same reason, shorter limbs reduce the surface area through which heat can be lost. Both of these patterns appear in human populations, though with considerable variation and many exceptions. The relatively compact body proportions seen in some Arctic and subarctic populations, the Inuit and related groups, for example, are consistent with cold climate adaptation. The long, lean proportions associated with some equatorial African populations, particularly among groups like the Nilotic peoples of South Sudan and Ethiopia, are consistent with heat dissipation adaptation. The body, it turns out, is shaped by latitude from top to bottom, not just at the skin. Scientists still debate how much of this variation in body proportion reflects genuine genetic adaptation to climate, as opposed to developmental plasticity, the ability of the body to adjust its growth patterns in response to the environment it experiences during childhood. Both processes are probably real, and both probably contribute to the patterns we observe. But the consistency of these patterns across populations with no historical contact with one another suggests that at least some of it is genuinely genetic. The same slow, patient work of natural selection that reshaped skin and eyes and hair and nose, writing the same answer in the same ink on a dozen different populations. By now, you can feel the weight of it, not just in the skin, not just in the color of an eye or the texture of a hair or the width of a nose, but in the whole body. Every population that moved away from Africa carried something with them, and every population that stayed in a new place long enough was slowly, quietly rewritten by it. The ice shaped them. The wind shaped them. The long, dark winters shaped them, not with intention, not with cruelty, simply with time. And time, as we have seen, is the most powerful force in biology. There is something we have not yet talked about, something that sits underneath all of the science we have covered so far. Underneath the mutations and the UV gradients and the vitamin D deficiencies and the agricultural transitions, and quietly complicates every clean narrative we try to build. Human beings do not stay still. They never have. From the very beginning of our story, from those first small groups walking out of Africa into an enormous and unknown world, movement has been the defining characteristic of our species. We migrate. We wander. We follow rivers and coastlines and trade routes and conquering armies and the slow pull of better land. And every time two populations meet, every time a group of people who have been separated for thousands of years, accumulating their own distinct genetic changes, suddenly finds itself in contact with another group, the genes begin to mix. Not cleanly, not all at once, not according to any plan, but inevitably, persistently across generations. The genes mix. And genes, it turns out, do not travel alone. When a pigmentation variant moves from one population to another, carried by a migrating individual, or by the children of a mixed union, or by the slow absorption of one group into another over centuries, it does not arrive by itself. It arrives embedded in a genome, surrounded by thousands of other variants, linked physically on the chromosome to neighboring genes that have nothing to do with skin color, genes affecting immune function, metabolism, disease resistance, height, facial structure, and dozens of other traits. This is what geneticists call linkage disequilibrium, the tendency of variants that sit physically close together on a chromosome to be inherited together, because the shuffling process that separates linked genes takes many generations to fully untangle them. A pigmentation gene, in other words, carries passengers, and those passengers can matter as much as the gene itself. Let's take a concrete example. The derived variant of SLC24A5, the light skin mutation we discussed in Section 6, did not spread through European populations in isolation. It spread as part of a larger genetic package, carried by the Anatolian farmers who migrated into Europe beginning around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. Those farmers brought lighter skin variants, yes, but they also brought variants associated with lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk sugar in adulthood, which is rare in most of the world but common in European and some African and Middle Eastern populations. They brought variants associated with reduced ability to digest certain plant compounds, a legacy of generations of agricultural diet that had selected for a gut adapted to cultivated foods. They brought variants associated with susceptibility and resistance to specific infectious diseases, diseases that were more common in the densely settled, animal-keeping communities of the early agricultural world than they had been among the dispersed hunter-gatherers who preceded them. The skin color change and all of these other changes arrived together, bundled inside the same migrating people. You cannot separate them cleanly. This is one reason why the study of human pigmentation is simultaneously a study of human migration history. Every time scientists find a pigmentation variant distributed in an unexpected pattern, present in a population where you might not expect it, absent in one where you might, they are often looking at the fingerprint of an ancient migration event. The genetics of skin color is a map, not just of where populations live now, but of where they came from and who they met along the way, and how thoroughly those meetings reshuffled the genetic deck. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this section. One of the most dramatic examples of pigmentation genes traveling with unexpected companions involves a population called the Mozabite Berbers of Algeria. The Mozabites carry a relatively high frequency of the derived SLC24A5 variant, the European light-skin allele, despite living in North Africa, far from the northern latitudes where that variant is most common. For a long time, this was puzzling. Why would a North African population living under intense Mediterranean and Saharan sun carry a variant associated with light skin and high frequencies? The answer, researchers now believe, lies in ancient population movements, specifically the back migration of populations with European or Middle Eastern ancestry into North Africa during the Neolithic and later periods, carrying the SLC24A5 variant with them. The Mosabites did not evolve lighter skin because their environment demanded it. They carry the variant because their ancestors mixed with people who carried it, people who had moved, as people always do, in directions the environment did not predict. There is something else worth noting about how genes travel. Not all genetic mixing happens gradually through the slow accumulation of individual encounters between neighboring populations. Sometimes it happens fast. Sometimes it is driven by events, invasions, conquests, plagues, climate disasters that move large numbers of people across large distances in short periods of time. The Mongol expansion of the 13th century carried Central Asian genetic variants across an enormous arc from China to Eastern Europe. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly transported West African genetic variants to the Americas, where they mixed with European and indigenous American variants in patterns that are still being mapped by geneticists today. The colonial period distributed European genetic variants across every continent. The modern era of global mobility has accelerated all of this to a speed that has no precedent in human evolutionary history. Scientists still debate how to model the complex, layered population histories that produced the genetic patterns we observe in modern human populations. The tools available for this work have become extraordinarily sophisticated in the last 2 decades. Ancient DNA sequencing, whole genome analysis, statistical methods that can detect signals of admixture and selection separated by thousands of years. But the populations themselves were complicated. They were not clean lineages, moving in straight lines, mixing in simple proportions. They were messy, overlapping, contradictory, surprising. They were human. And this messiness, this beautiful, irreducible complexity, is part of what makes the story of human pigmentation so much more interesting than a simple before and after tale. It is not a story about populations moving from dark to light in a straight line. It is a story about genes flowing through populations like water through a landscape, finding unexpected paths, pooling in unexpected places, carving channels where no one would have predicted. It is a story that is still unfolding. Right now, in every mixed marriage, in every migrating family, in every child born carrying the genetic legacy of 2 continents, the genes are still traveling. They always have been. Let's slow down for a moment. Not because the story is ending, we still have a little way to go, but because we have reached a place in the narrative where honesty requires us to pause, look around, and acknowledge something important. Science is not a finished building. It is a construction site. A beautiful, endlessly fascinating, occasionally chaotic construction site where brilliant people argue passionately about the interpretation of evidence, where new findings regularly overturn old certainties, and where the most honest answer to many of the deepest questions is not a confident declaration, but a carefully qualified and genuinely exciting. We are not entirely sure yet. The story of why humans became lighter-skinned in northern latitudes is not an exception to this. It is one of the most actively debated topics in the field of human evolutionary genetics. And tonight, we're going to sit with that debate for a while. The dominant explanation, the one you will find in most textbooks, the one that Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin's landmark work brought to the center of the field, is the vitamin D hypothesis. The argument, as we have traced it across this story, runs roughly as follows. Dark skin evolved in equatorial Africa to protect against intense UV radiation and the folate destruction it causes, became a liability in northern latitudes where UV radiation is weaker. In those northern environments, dark skin blocked too much of the UVB radiation needed to synthesize vitamin D in the skin. Vitamin D deficiency compromised bone health, immune function, and reproductive success. Natural selection therefore favored individuals with lighter skin, those carrying mutations that reduced melanin production because they could synthesize more vitamin D from the limited northern sunlight. Over generations, lighter skin variants spread through northern populations, reaching the frequencies we observe in modern Europeans and through parallel but distinct genetic pathways in East Asian populations. It is a clean, elegant, biologically plausible story, and it is probably at least partly right. But here is where the complications begin. The first complication is timing. If lighter skin evolved primarily because of vitamin D pressure in northern latitudes, you would expect the key lightening mutations to have begun spreading as soon as populations settled those northern latitudes, which happened, in the case of Europe, at least 40,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens first arrived there. But the ancient DNA evidence we discussed in Section 8 tells a different story. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe for thousands of years before the arrival of agriculture, people like Labrana I, dating to around 7,000 years ago, still carried dark-skin variants at many key pigmentation loci. The rapid spread of lighter-skin variants in Europe appears to have happened much more recently, largely within the last 8,000 years, and possibly concentrated even more recently than that. If UV and vitamin D were the primary drivers, why did it take so long? This is the question that has pushed researchers to look for additional explanations. One leading alternative, or rather, complementary, hypothesis focuses on the agricultural transition. As we explored in Section 8, the shift from hunter-gatherer diets to grain-based agricultural diets dramatically reduced dietary vitamin D intake. This dietary change, the argument goes, intensified the selection pressure for lighter skin precisely during the Neolithic period, which is exactly when the ancient DNA evidence suggests lighter skin variants began to spread rapidly. The timing aligns considerably better. In this version of the story, lighter skin in Europeans is not primarily a Paleolithic adaptation to northern latitudes. It is partly a Neolithic adaptation to agricultural diets. The second major complication involves sexual selection. Sexual selection, the process by which traits spread, not because they improve survival, but because they are preferred in mate choice, is a powerful evolutionary force, and it has been proposed as a contributor to the spread of lighter skin in northern populations. The specific argument varies, depending on the researcher making it. Some propose that lighter skin was associated, in certain cultural contexts, with health or youth, since skin tends to lighten with age in some conditions and with illness, and that this association made lighter skin attractive as a mate signal. Others have proposed more specific cultural mechanisms, that in certain northern societies, lighter skin in women was preferentially chosen by men, or vice versa, creating a feedback loop that accelerated the spread of lightening variants beyond what natural selection alone would have produced. The sexual selection hypothesis is controversial. Critics point out that it is difficult to test directly, that the evidence for it is largely circumstantial, and that the vitamin D and dietary hypotheses are sufficient to explain the observed patterns without invoking mate preference. Supporters argue that dismissing sexual selection entirely is itself an assumption, and that the speed of the observed genetic changes in some populations may require an explanation beyond vitamin D alone. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this section. There is a third hypothesis, less discussed, more speculative, but genuinely interesting, that proposes a connection between skin lightening and the regulation of circadian rhythms in low-light environments. The argument runs as follows. In northern latitudes, light levels, not just UV, but visible light overall, are dramatically lower in winter than in equatorial environments. Lighter skin reflects more light into the environment, which sounds counterproductive. But some researchers have proposed that lighter skin may also interact differently with light at the cellular level, potentially influencing the body's internal clock in ways that help regulate sleep, mood, and hormonal cycles in low-light environments. This hypothesis is far from proven. It exists at the speculative edge of the field, and most researchers consider the vitamin D and dietary explanations more robustly supported. But it is a reminder that biology is a system and that adaptations rarely do only one thing. Scientists still debate, vigorously, productively, with genuine intellectual excitement, the relative contributions of UV radiation, vitamin D synthesis, dietary change, sexual selection, population movement, and random genetic drift to the pigmentation patterns we observe in modern human populations. The answer is almost certainly not any single one of these factors acting alone. It is almost certainly a combination, different factors dominant in different populations at different times, under different environmental and cultural conditions. The full picture is still being assembled. New ancient DNA findings continue to arrive, each one shifting the debate a little, adding a new piece to a puzzle that is larger and more complex than anyone initially imagined. And that, in its own way, is the most comforting thing about this story. It is not finished. The scientists have not agreed. The picture is not complete, which means there is still more to discover, still more to understand about who we are, where we came from, and how the long conversation between human bodies and the environments they moved through wrote itself into every shade of skin on Earth. The building is still under construction, and it is beautiful. Close your eyes for a moment, or keep them open if they still are softly unfocused the way eyes go when the mind is drifting. And try to hold in your mind the full spectrum of human skin, not as categories, not as labels or boxes or any of the social constructions that human beings have built around color across their complicated histories. Just as color itself, the extraordinary, continuous, breathtaking range of it, from the deepest blue-black of certain West African and Melanesian populations, a richness of pigmentation so deep it carries an almost luminous quality in certain lights, to the palest rose ivory of northern Scandinavian or Irish skin, so translucent that the blue of veins shows through the wrist. And between those poles, every possible gradation. The warm mahogany of South Asian skin, the golden amber of East Asian complexions, the reddish-brown of many indigenous American peoples, the olive-green undertones of Mediterranean populations, the complex, layered mix of tones found across the African continent itself, where the greatest diversity of human skin color on Earth exists, not between Africa and the rest of the world, but within Africa. This is the mosaic. This is what 300,000 years of Homo sapiens history and millions of years of earlier human evolution has produced. Not a handful of distinct types. A spectrum, a gradient, a continuous, unbroken flow of variation that resists every attempt to divide it into neat categories. The science of melanin helps us understand why this spectrum exists and why it is continuous rather than categorical. Skin color is, as we have noted throughout this story, a polygenic trait. It is controlled not by one gene, not by two or three, but by dozens of genetic variants, each contributing a small increment of effect, each inherited independently, each capable of being combined in an almost infinite number of ways. This is why children can have skin tones that differ from both parents. This is why siblings from the same family can have noticeably different complexions. This is why the spectrum is smooth rather than stepped, because with dozens of contributing variants, each segregating independently across generations, the possible combinations are effectively continuous. There is no gene for white skin. There is no gene for black skin. There are dozens of variants, each nudging the melanin dial slightly up or slightly down, combining and recombining across every generation, in every population, on every continent. Here is something that the science makes clear, and that is worth stating plainly. The genetic differences between human populations that affect skin color are real. They're measurable, they have specific molecular causes, and they have evolutionary histories that we can trace. But they are also, in the context of the full human genome, extraordinarily small. Human beings, as a species, are genetically remarkably similar to one another. The total genetic variation within our species is low compared to many other primates, a legacy of that founding bottleneck we discussed in Section 3, the small group of people who walked out of Africa carrying only a fraction of the genetic diversity that existed on the continent they left behind. Studies have consistently found that the genetic variation between individuals within any given population accounts for the vast majority of human genetic diversity, somewhere between 85 and 95% of it. The variation between populations, including the variation in pigmentation genes, accounts for only a small fraction of the total. We are, genetically speaking, one people, wearing different clothes. The range of skin tones found across the human species today is the result of a relatively small number of genetic variants, distributed in different frequencies across populations, reflecting the different UV environments and dietary histories and migration patterns of those populations' ancestors. It is a thin layer of variation, sitting on top of an enormous shared foundation. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this section. Skin color can change within a single human lifetime, not through genetic change, but through the body's remarkable capacity to adjust melanin production in response to UV exposure. This is what we call tanning. When UV radiation strikes the skin, it triggers a signaling cascade that stimulates melanocytes to produce more eumelanin, a protective response that darkens the skin within days of sun exposure. This capacity for rapid, reversible melanin adjustment exists in virtually all human beings, though the range and speed of the response varies with baseline melanin levels. People with darker skin tans can deepen significantly in high UV environments. People with very light skin may burn before they can tan effectively, because their melanocytes are slow to respond and their baseline protection is low. But the mechanism itself, the ability to darken the skin in response to UV, is ancient, shared, and universal. It is a reminder that the body is not a fixed thing. It is a responsive thing, always listening to the environment, always adjusting within the range its genes allow. There's another dimension to this mosaic that is easy to overlook. Skin color is not uniform across the body. Even within a single individual, skin tone varies. Lighter on the inner arms and palms, darker on the face and hands and other sun-exposed areas. This variation within individuals mirrors, in miniature, the variation between populations, both driven by the same mechanism, the same melanin response to different levels of UV exposure. We carry the whole story on our own skin. The same forces that shaped human diversity across continents are at work on the surface of every individual body, adjusting, responding, remembering the sun. Scientists still debate the precise number of genetic variants involved in human skin color variation. Estimates have ranged from a handful of major effect genes to hundreds of smaller contributors, and new variants continue to be identified as genome-wide association studies grow larger and more sophisticated. What is not debated is the beauty of the result. A species that began in Africa with dark skin evolved for one of the most demanding solar environments on Earth, and then walked slowly over tens of thousands of years through deserts and ice fields and river valleys and mountain passes into every corner of the planet, adjusting, adapting, changing, and producing, in the process, this extraordinary, continuous, unclassifiable range of human color. Not a palette of distinct shades, a gradient, unbroken from one end of the world to the other. We have come a long way tonight, not just across time, though we have crossed more than 2 million years of it, from the open savannas of early Africa to the ice-scoured plains of Pleistocene Europe, to the river valleys of ancient East Asia, to the grain fields of the first farmers. We have also come a long way in understanding. understanding what skin color is, what is not, what it means in the deep biological sense, the sense that strips away everything cultural and historical and social, and leaves only the quiet, patient conversation between a body and the environment it inhabits. And now, in this last section, we're going to do something that feels right at the end of a journey this long. We're going to come home. Africa is still there, still enormous, still ancient, still the most genetically diverse place on Earth. The people who live there today, the Yoruba of Nigeria, the San of Southern Africa, the Amhara of Ethiopia, the Zulu of South Africa, the Hadza of Tanzania, and hundreds of other distinct peoples across a continent far larger and more varied than most maps suggest, carry within their genomes a depth of genetic diversity that the rest of the world combined cannot match. This is not a poetic claim. It is a genetic fact, measured, replicated, and consistently confirmed across decades of research. The out-of-Africa migration that we traced in Section 3, that small, extraordinary exodus of perhaps a few thousand individuals, sometime around 60,000 years ago, took with it only a fraction of the genetic variation that existed in Africa at the time. Everything that happened after that, every adaptation, every migration, every population mixing event, every skin-lightening mutation, every blue eye and straight hair and narrow nose, happened within that fraction. Africa kept the rest. The San people of southern Africa, sometimes called the Bushmen, though many members of this group prefer the name San, are among the oldest distinct human populations on Earth. Genetic studies suggest that their lineage diverged from other human lineages at least 100,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. They have been living in southern Africa, largely continuously, for longer than Homo sapiens has existed outside of Africa. Their genomes carry genetic variants found nowhere else on Earth. Fragments of human diversity so ancient that they predate the divergence of all other modern human populations. When you look at the full sweep of human genetic history, the San are not a branch on the tree. They are close to the root, and their skin is not the very darkest found in Africa. The San tend to have a warm, medium brown complexion, lighter than the very dark skin of some equatorial African populations, reflecting the lower UV intensity of southern Africa compared to the equatorial belt. Because skin color, as we have seen, is always a local answer to a local question. Even within Africa, even among the oldest human populations on Earth, the melanin dial has been tuned by latitude and UV and the slow, patient arithmetic of natural selection. The same forces, the same mechanism, the same conversation between body and sky, just with different answers in different places. Here is the lesser-known curiosity for this final section. Some of the genetic variants associated with lighter skin in non-African populations are not, in fact, absent in Africa. They exist there too, at low frequencies in certain populations having arisen independently or having been reintroduced through ancient back migrations from Eurasia into Africa. This means that the genetic raw material for lighter skin was not invented outside of Africa. It was present in the human genome all along, part of the standing variation that existed within African populations, waiting as all genetic variation waits for an environment in which it would prove useful. The mutations did not appear from nowhere when humans entered new environments. They were drawn from a reservoir of existing variation, selected, amplified, spread by the new environments those humans found themselves in. Evolution does not create from nothing. It selects from what is already there. And what was already there in the genomes of the people who left Africa was enough. More than enough. Scientists still debate the full complexity of African population history, the migrations within the continent, the ancient divergences and reunions between populations, the back migrations from Eurasia, the extraordinary internal diversity that makes Africa not one genetic story, but dozens of overlapping, intertwining stories. This internal complexity is one of the least discussed and most important frontiers in human evolutionary genetics. Because understanding human diversity truly understanding it, in all its depth and texture, requires understanding Africa first. Everything else is downstream. And so we return at the end of this long journey to where we began. A bright sky, an open plain, a group of people walking upright in a world that is trying its best to shape them. The sun overhead, not as enemy, not as friend, but simply as a force. Relentless, impartial, ancient, and below it, the skin, that thin, extraordinary interface between the inside of a human body and the outside of the world, doing what it has always done. Listening, adjusting, surviving. Every person alive today carries this story on their skin. Not metaphorically, literally. The shade of your skin, whatever it is a record of where your ancestors lived and for how long and under what sky. It is a letter written over thousands of generations in a language of melanin and mutation and the slow, patient pressure of the sun. It says, we were here. We adapted. We survived. It says, we were all once the same. And we still are. The differences are real, measurable, biological, beautiful in their variety. But their surface, beneath them, the genome is ancient and shared in common. Beneath the mosaic, the same old story, the same African origin, the same long walk, the same skin, learning to speak the language of every sky it has ever lived beneath. And so the journey ends, or rather, it does not end, because journeys like this one never truly end. They simply reach a place where it feels right to stop walking for a while, to sit down on the warm earth, to look up at whatever sky happens to be above you tonight. You have traveled a long way in the last hour or so. You have stood beneath the equatorial African sun and felt, in some small imagined way, what it meant to need dark skin as armor, to need it the way you need water, the way you need air, the way you need the people walking beside you. You have followed the first wanderers northward into landscapes that grew quieter and colder and dimmer, and you have felt the slow, invisible pressure of a sun that was no longer enough, a sun that could not quite reach through the skin to do the work the body needed done. You have watched, in the patient, geological way that evolutionary change allows for watching, as the body found its answers. One mutation at a time, one generation at a time, in Europe and in East Asia and in all the complicated, overlapping, endlessly surprising places in between. And now you are here. Wherever here is for you tonight, in a city or a village or a house at the end of a quiet road, under a sky that is dark now, the sun long gone, the UV radiation that shaped the entire story we have just told each other completely absent, at least until morning. Your skin is resting. Your melanocytes are quiet. The ancient machinery that connects you to every human being who ever lived beneath any sun on any continent is still, for now, in the soft suspension of the night. Let your body be heavy. Let your thoughts slow to the pace of geological time. Not urgent, not pressured, not moving anywhere in particular. Just drifting the way populations drift, the way genes drift, the way the whole long story of human life on this planet has drifted, not toward any destination, but forward, always forward, into whatever comes next. You are made of ancient material. Every atom in your body has been part of this world for longer than you can comfortably imagine. Every cell in your skin carries the legacy of a conversation between your ancestors and their environments, stretching back through thousands of generations to a place in Africa where the sun was bright and the grass was gold, and the first recognizably human eyes looked up at a sky that was also, in its own way, looking back. You belong to all of that, the whole long story. The African origin and the northern migration and the genetic mutations and the agricultural fields and the ice ages and the mixing of peoples and the slow, patient rewriting of the human body by the world it chose to inhabit. It is all in you. It has always been in you. Resting now as you are resting. Quiet now as the night is quiet. Safe. Sweet dreams.